Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Happy weekend. It's Saturday. Thank you all for coming through. Proclamation, news and gatherings. We're picking up from where I left off. If any of you are on the same, we are on the module DD 103, investigating the social world. Now, we want to understand politics, don't we? We all want to understand politics. Politics in everyday life. Picking up where we left off. We're trying to govern the commons. We're looking at governing the commons. We talked about yesterday. Derelict land, derelict buildings. Can we build on them? It's all a political argument. It's all a political debate with the council, parliament, community. It's all people policy. Is it the indigenous people almost? We can almost say. Absolutely. Indigenous, the West, the Western culture. Where all the environment, the environmental landscapes, and national resources. Look at, compared to the East. What is over the East? That's, what's over the East that you could call the commons? Not a great deal, is there, really? Over the East, I'd say there's more, it's more about transportation over the East, I'd say. You're like, we have got Dover, we've got Southampton over the West. But I'd say more West is more common resources, farmland, talking about landscape, environmental. I'd say over the East is more greenland, isn't there? Anyway, in the UK I'm talking about. I don't know about any other cultures in other nations. Anyway, we're going on to govern the commons. Page 160, following the module of investigating the social world 2, DD 103, edited by Deborah H, Drake, Andy Morris, Alan Shipman, and Katie Samuel, Arts and Humanities. Governing the commons. So far, you have looked at conflicts arising from the extraction of natural resources from indigenous peoples. There you go. Lands and some solutions to reconcile these conflicts. Ironically, it is a contemporary approach to nature conservation that comes into conflict with indigenous lands most often. Protected areas are cornerstones of modern day nature conservation. The Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, United States, set up in 1872, is credited for being the first protected area in the world. Figure 5.4. Since then, this network of nature reserves have expanded rapidly with nearly 160,000 protected areas, now covering an area of nearly 25 million square metres. More than 13% of the Earth's land surface, according to the World Database of Protected Areas, the WCMC, 2014. The focus of this network of protected areas is the conservation of biological diversity, and the argument is that protection is necessary for saving numerous other species with which humans share this planet. However, many of these areas have often antagonized indigenous peoples, some of whom depend on natural resources from these protected areas for their livelihoods in this case. One form of governance has unseen or unintended consequences for other forms of land use on which local communities depend. So how can protected areas work with rather than against local communities? It's all, it's a political debate, isn't it? You want to build on these derelict environmental lands. You want to make it accountability of population growth. But it's derelict land. But by all means, that state sovereignty law is made it derelict. Shouldn't be allowed to build on it, regardless. Page 162. A protected area is a clearly defined geographical space recognized, dedicated and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature, which is associated ecosystem services and cultural values. In Dudley 2008, page 8 to 9. In 2012, Gustavo Andrade and Jonathan Rhodes carried out analysis of 55 published case studies for developing countries close vicinity or formerly protected areas. They wanted to discover factors that minimise conflicts between the regulation of protected areas and the interest of the local people. They assessed these case studies for a variety of measures. How old the protected area is, how large the protected area is, whether or not there is a buffer zone around the protected area, what level of protection is enforced within the protected area, what is the per head wealth within the community, what is the population density in the immediate vicinity of the protected area, how involved the local community is in the management of the protected area. Their quantitative analysis indicated that the greater the participation of the local community in making decisions about the protected area, the less was the conflict between the people and the protected area. For many examples, in Romania, Solomon Island, women in the community decided to get closely involved in managing and monitoring natural resources and set their own rules for access to these resources. This helped to halt illegal activities by members of the community inside strict resource usage zones, which were common before the woman took Andre and advised suggest that if protected areas are to work for nature, then they also need to work for people. Does this mean different forms of protected areas and different ways of managing them? One of the recommendations that came out of the Fifth World Parks Congress of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the JUCN, held in Durban in 2003, was about community conserved areas, which subsequently become known as indigenous and community conserved areas, the ICCAs. These areas are defined as natural and modified ecosystems, including significant biodiversity, ecological services and cultural values, functionally conserved by indigenous and local communities through customary laws and other effective means. Kofari, 2006. What distinguishes that sites from protected areas is that they are predominantly controlled and managed by communities, and there is often a commitment on the part of stakeholder communities to conserve biodiversity. As these sites, the commitment takes the form of various informed means, such as cultural taboos of community, protocols regarding access to or harvesting of resources at the sites. While this type of informal conservation is recognised through their international instruments, such as the Convention of Biological Diversity or the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the appreciation of these informal practices as an instrument for the conservation of biological diversity was first proposed at the 2003 World Parks Congress. You know, we've got where I live in Essex, in Colchester. That's my constituency. We've got a country park, a nature reserve, country park. It's got a lake, it's got a park for children, and it's got a big forest to walk through. Massive, it's quite big. And who's the priority is it took after? The indigenous people. They're looking after the national park. Or national park, but if I was to say mapping home in Colchester, that is, I'd say that's home for me. That is my home. I'm mapping home. I'm going to say the country park. That's where I live. I live at the country park, Colchester, oldest recorded town in Essex. There's so much here with Colchester Castle. I can't remember how long ago that was built or who by, but I know that it's also governed through the Parliament. So it's a lot. We're talking about governing the commons, and this is kind of gives you, think of it of a sceptical point of, description. Sceptical description. I'm trying to give you exactly what it says on the tin. The ICCAs are present on all continents except Antarctica and these sites are privileged over others in providing relatively secure spaces for biological diversity on all human-dominated planets. Bagwatch and Root 2006. Despite the small size of the sites, they are widely distributed, and as unmanaged habitats within highly managed landscapes, they provide so-called ecosystem services, benefits that people derive from natural ecosystems. For example, a distributed network of sacred groves might provide the ecosystem service of pollination, beneficial for many agricultural crops as unmanaged storage in addition. They are also repositories of non-wood forest products, particularly of medical herbs, which they are important in local healthcare systems. So let me sort this out. The ICCAs, such as a community, forest in figure 5.5 from a network of protected areas informally protected by the communities. These networks are often located in places where no other form of forest protection is possible. As such, they provide a valuable ecosystem service to activities such as farming and food production can take place in landscapes surrounding areas. Talk about ecosystem. Talk about the common resources on the farmland, the production, keeping it friendly environment, safe and efficient. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms in conjunction with their no living components of their environment interacting in the system, and biotic and abiotic components are linked together through nutrient cycles and energy flows. So you've got, to talk about country park, you've got the is it the pH test or the water test? They put water testers in the lake, making sure it's eco-friendly, eco-safe for the fish, freshwater fish to survive in. Making sure it's not polluted, making sure people are not finding their rubbish in there. They've got litter pickers and God knows what else. They work for the council over there. So it's nice. It's a nice, peaceful place to go. People look after it. I'm pretty sure there's many more. And if you're living in London or if you're in America or wherever you're from in over the globe listening, this what I'm studying is all about. It's not just English. It's every aspect of every nation. We've got Somalia. We had a bit of privacy. Talking about privacy the other day in Somalia, even if you like. Page 164. Chapter 5: Indigenous Lands and Territories, Mapping the Commons. Therefore, as informal protected areas, the ICCAs offer a large number of benefits to local people while completing the formal protected area networks. They also provide shelter to species, habitats and ecosystems that are sufficiently protected within the formal reserve networks. Thank you, RF, thank you. They also provide shelter to species, habitats and ecosystems that are not sufficiently protected within the formal reserve networks. ICCAs, however, are struggling to be recognised by their state authorities because they are largely governed by customary laws. Norms and institutions that are not formally or legally recognised in many countries. As a result, the ICCAs are facing a number of threats. Discussed in recommendation of 3.26, land is unclear and insecure. The state authority plan community development projects on these lands that often fail. The state authorities can easily delegitimise customary rights associated with these lands. State authorities do not consult communities when making decisions about the future of these areas. The stakeholders of the areas are often seriously disadvantaged in social, economic and political terms. The lack of long-term security of these areas is leading to cultural change and the loss of knowledge. The commercialisation of resources challenging some of the traditional modes of resource extraction practiced at these sites. These continuing threats have been attributed to differences between the interests of indigenous peoples and those of state authorities. These differences are reflected in the approach to management of conservation areas by the two groups. The lack of legal recognition of many of these areas also means that they may not always be recognised and respected beyond the stakeholder community, despite calls for their recognition in international conservation politics. Therefore, there are still serious hurdles to their effective and appropriate recognition in national policies and practices. The well-established models on which present-day economic decisions are made are among the primary reasons why the commons and their governments have not been recognised in the natural resource management. Science writer Wendy Nicole contends that policymakers opted for two opposite solutions to protecting the commons: privatise natural resources, leading to payment for ecosystem services type projects, or have governments lock natural areas up in the preserves. The latter usually meant stripping rights from the locals who had long used the commons for subsistence, fishing or hunting, or in the case of forests, gathering firewood, medicinal plants, and other forest products. Many governments, supported by large conservation organisations, evicted indigenous peoples from their homeland in the belief they damaged the ecosystems. Writing about an alternative worldview, expounded by Eleanor Ostrom, Nicole goes on to suggest that the Ostrom research found that such policies to make natural resources private are unhelpful for their conservation. Ostrom's work on governing the commons highlighted that many of the evicted people receive little or no government assistance and end up as a conservation refugee, adrift when nowhere to go and no means to support themselves. This is why we all live in, talk about the sociological difference. If you can look after your own commons, look after your own commons, your own hygiene within your house, in your vicinity where you live, not taking life for granted. You get put in you can get put in a rural suburban area, or you get put in what I like to call an aristocracy environment. Chapter 8, Indigenous Lands and Territories Mapping the Commons. This demands a change in the outlook towards indigenous lands and territories, and the modes of their management informed by their traditional methods. As such, Ostrom 1990 proposed 8 design principles for governing the commons. Box 5.3, Ostrom 8 design principles of governing the commons. Define clear group boundaries. Match rules govern use of common goods to local needs and conditions. 3. Ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. Make sure the ruling make rights of community members and respected by outside authorities. Develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behaviour. Use graduated sanctions for rule violators. Provide accessible low-cost means for dispute resolution. Build responsible for governing the common resource and nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. Ostrom used the concept of the polycentric governance to examine the usefulness of her 8 design principles. Taken in a Nobel lecture, Ostrom argued, designing institutions to force or nudge entirely self-interested individuals to achieve better outcomes has been the major goal posited by policy analysts for governments to accomplish for much of the past half-century. Intensive empirical research leads me to argue that instead, a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans. We need to ask how diverse polycentric institutions help or hinder the innovativeness, learning, adapting, trustworthiness, levels of cooperation of participants, and the achievement of more effective, equitable, and sustainable outcomes at multiple scales. The governance of indigenous lands and territories requires polycentric arrangement as described by Ostrom. For this to happen, the regional national and international policies, laws and regulations need to work in sync with local governance structures, such as a multi-level approach is necessary for governance of these complex social ecological systems, which have historically come under threat from the top-down mode of regulation. Summary: areas formerly protected for nature conservation can come into conflict with the commons, such as indigenous lands and territories, and specifically community conserved areas. The complex governance structures involved in governing the commons can work against allocating greater power to indigenous peoples. Ostrom proposed the idea of polycentric governance of these complex social ecological systems. Look at the conclusion. This chapter is started by looking at how some parts of the world are made explorable and exploited for profit, and by contrast have some communities seek to maintain areas to land or resources. These commons are often come into the enclosures claimed by the politically powerful for profit. The case studies of such conflict highlighted the fight that the commoners have put against the forces who strive to restrict access to the land and its resources. You know, you talk about putting a new airport up in a farm field, but you know, it's the natural resources come from the farmland. It happens every so often. Shouldn't happen, but it does happen. In many places, laws are not equipped to deal with informal ownership of land, making it easier for external powers to exploit the land. This has been the plight of many indigenous communities around the world. The struggle of the Dongria, the Kondi, and the Vedanta was examined in this chapter, as were the practices of cancer mapping, which in many cases have proven useful for showing on a map what the official version of the map often ignores. These alternative representation of territories and resources are powerful tools in shaping how the use of land is understood and intervened in. Ironically, protected areas that are set aside of nature conservation are often the ones that conflict with the rights of indigenous peoples to manage their land and to use them for substance or cultural practices. Research conducted with local communities has examined the possibility of greater inclusion of local communities in the management of protected areas. In doing so, the concept of polycentric governance is commonly put forward, but legal frameworks and regulations are at regional, national and international level operate alongside local frameworks. At the local level, people devise their own systems of natural resource management based on traditional methods of state. This form of authority is better suited to govern the complexity of actors, landscapes and practices that characterise indigenous lands and territories. That's block 4. We're going to block 4, exploring boundaries. Exploring boundaries, ladies and gents. Introduction, page 175. In the first half of this book, you have considered how the relationship between human populations and common resources is understood, debated, politicised and managed. You have learned there is a complex relationship between the nation of natural resources and social resources, and that the boundaries can shift and change over time and place. In the second half of this book, the focus moves to the topic of boundaries and their significance of making social worlds. This will entail distinguishing between physical and symbolic components of boundaries and learning how these different types of boundaries create senses of proximity and distance. Identification and difference. Boundary creates sense of proximity and distance. Identification and difference. You will see how boundaries can be visible to some and to some people and invisible to others, and also how they have different meanings for the effects on different people depending on gender, race, ethnicity, class, age, and many other social characteristics. Through the cases we've explored, you'll discover how boundaries are governed, controlled, regulated, and managed in different ways across time and place. So we're talking about age. Talking about age, forget race, and I mean race could come into, like part of the society where they've got religion or faith or whatever, something like that. But I'm talking about age. Think about age. You're 13-year-old. Where does he stand when it comes to this political argument? National Park. It's got a children's park there, isn't it? The kids need park. They need areas to play in. They need, things to do. So the children have rights within their school to get involved in politics. Everyone's involved in politics. Everyone's everyday life. I say it time and time again. People don't know politics. They think, politics is everyone's everyday life. All you're worried about is what's coming on your next soap TV. But in reality, politics is in your everyday life. Equalities. You're not saying PAYE. I'm in politics every day, fighting for my rights and my children. Getting a 50-50 adulthood that I should be shared from day one. It shouldn't be in a debatable argument that I've got to go through the course and I should be able to just go and pick my kids up in an amicable sense. But the difference is, I left on a note which was a chemistry reaction, a chemical reaction between love and hate. So we went our separate ways, and now we'll go for a court scenario. But it should be, straight away, my deed as a father, it's not done because I'm a father from day one to the day I die, regardless of the mother's consequence. No disrespect to the mothers out there, we'll go through life of purgatory, but it's time to let go of hatred and just go, yeah, he's a father. There you go, simple. Let's get on with our life. You move on, I'll move on. Let's move on. Anyway, moving on. I always bring that up all the time. It's a strain in my life. Not a big strain, it's a strain in my life. My kids are important, and me knowing that they're safe at every given time. Me knowing I've given them every bit of knowledge they need to get their academics throughout the year is important for a father. Making sure they're pushing and giving it their all at school. Everything they put their hands into, be the best you can be. I know that's everyone's go-to in life. Be the best version of you in life. But I'd like to have some sort of saying, bit of guidance in what they do, as a father and mother would. Anyway, moving on. Let's consider a graphic illustration of such a difference. Take an example of the border between countries, which is one specific kind of boundary. The United States shares borders with Mexico in the south and Canada in the north. Yet, this is where the similarity ends. The border with Canada is relatively easy to cross. With the appropriate passport, it passes through miles of forest, prairies and mountains, with a little sign of high security measures amongst most of its length. The border between Mexico and the United States offers a stark contrast. In the border to restrict and contain what is defined as unlawful migration from Latin America, the border is guarded by more than 20,000 border patrols agents, marked by innumerable wire fences, and is highly militarized, with explicit intention of keeping people out. It is estimated that 300,000 people still enter the United States illegally each year. People are killed on the border, attempting to cross from the south to the north. That's where they have gun patrols, people trying to break an entry. This is what I talk about when I talk about criminalization. It's criminal to cross a border, unlawful. Especially if you're going there for no hope to work, just going there to racketeering or human trafficking or whatever you're going, go across the border. But you're not going there to work, you're not going there to reside because you've got a visa in the first place. So you're going there to break an entry. That's why we call it criminalization. It's not clever, it's not big, it's not clever. Why they're doing it. This is why Brexit's been delivered, and that's why it's voted to stop all that going on here. And it's the same in most countries. Mexico got their border up. Scotland, they've got their border up, haven't they? Scotland's very independent, very in charge of their laws. Nicola Sturgeon's very diplomatic. Anyway, moving on. Some boundaries are hard, impermeable, and fixed, while others use soft and permeable. Important here, as you will discover, is the question of power. Who has the power to define boundaries, and who has the power to contest and resist them? Social sciences provide different routes into understanding how boundaries divide the social world and make distinctions between social groups. In this chapter that you follow, we'll consider the topic of boundaries through the notion of justice, a concept closely related to rights. Justice is a complex idea that many meanings and is understood from different theoretical perspectives. Many definitions of justice begin from an understanding of fairness. You will probably all have heard a form and understanding of fairness. You will probably have all heard a child crying out, and the parents' common answer is, "Darling, life is not meant to be fair." In the following chapters, the specific focus will be on social, criminal, logical, environmental, and trade justice, with each chapter paying attention to various ideas of justice play out in particular contexts. These contexts include the borders between countries or in the soundscapes of daily life, the democratic public and private places, or in the practice of a fair trade. You will be considering an interconnection between these different forms of justice, and in doing so, will be learning to employ the valuable social science skills in debating and communicating as a social scientist. You need to learn how to explore different perspectives, weigh up the relative merits, and participate within debates about them. Part of your role as a social scientist is to be able to communicate effectively and to make an informed intervention into the debates. In this chapter, you'll be focusing on the city as a way to explore diverse boundaries and the theme of justice and the usefulness of debate. Boundaries and city. In this chapter and the four that follow, you will encounter different kinds of boundaries. You will discover the boundaries are complex and can be physical and symbolic, fixed or fluid, and visible or invisible. Can you think of one example of each of the following types of boundary? Physical, a boundary that has material presence. Symbolic, a boundary that exists in the imagination, or through an individual or group giving it a meaning. Fixed and impermeable, a boundary that is permanent and difficult to cross. Fluid and permeable, a boundary that shifts and can be passed through. Visible, a boundary that can be seen. Invincible, boundary that can't be seen. For which each of these examples, think about for whom particular example might matter, such as women or older people. In this section that follow, you'll find the answer to this question. Boundaries are constructed and maintained across almost every setting in this social world, offering a way of ordering and regulating social life. This chapter takes as its setting the contemporary city to explore diverse and varied forms of boundary. In particular, you'll be encouraged to explore physical and symbolic boundaries. Physical boundaries are those that have a material presence, such as walls or bollards. These are usually visible, though there are instances where you might not see them, and more often they are fixed rather than permeable. Symbolic boundaries are boundaries that are imagined or are created by the particular meaning we attach them, such as the qualities we assign to the people that belong to different social groups. Symbolic boundaries are not typically visible. How boundaries operate. The city can be thought of as space that concentrates differences through its density of people interacting in their daily lives, often with a high intensity. The high intensity of interaction was considered by an early German sociologist, George Simmel, 1903, who argued that the city living resulted in an overstimulation and an excess of emotion for the individuals, leading them to withdraw from the city life. Living in cities now today does indeed demand a high level of interaction in the streets as pedestrians, in other cars and as motorists, as well as in our work and consumption activities. For individuals, groups and communities seeking to make sense of a city living, drawing boundaries around the home of a community to which they belong is in one response. In such circumstances, erecting boundaries might be a matter of choice. For example, people who choose to live privately owned, gated communities represent this kind of boundary making in the city, which shall be discussed further later in this chapter. While gay people choose to live and work in defined parts of the city in close proximity to each other, might represent another. Are these two cases the same? Both are clear examples of people safeguarding themselves out of this choice. But their reasons for doing so may be different, as might be the power to do so. Historically and sometimes still today, gay people were harassed in public, so separating themselves into specific localities in the city might be as much about self-protection as about the celebration of a minority lifestyle. Other examples include that the council housing estate that has a reputation, which may or may not be an urban myth, of high levels of crime, where few outsiders choose to cross boundary into the estate. Is this boundary operating to protect those who are resident, or to keep people out? Or what about a discussed piece of land that becomes popular for young skateboarders, and which gradually becomes their territory? Why might an older woman feel unable to enter? There are just some illustrations of the different kinds of boundaries you might encounter in the city. An important question for you to consider is how and why boundaries operate in different ways. Peter Marcus 2000 makes the point that the faces of separation between different parts of the contemporary city, ethnicity, lifestyle, class, race, religion and sexuality, have very different impacts on the city. Marcus suggests that a general rule, divisions by class and race tend to be hierarchical, involuntary, socially determined, rigid, exclusionary and incompatible with a democratic city life, although often legitimated as cultural divisions. Divisions by ethnicity and lifestyle tend to be cultural and voluntary, individually determined, fluid and non-exclusionary, and consistent with a democratic lifestyle. Marcus' framework is useful, although there are some problems with this formulation as it stands. Can you think what these might be? In this discussion, in the first set of divisions, it depends what side of the divide you are on. If you're on a group that impose the boundary, then the divisions are not involuntary. Similarly, where groups can choose to live separately on the basis of lifestyle and ethnicity. It is grouped from the situation where it is the only route to feeling safe in the city, central to these diversions as questions of power and income. Page 181. Summary. Boundaries divide groups from one another. They're used by different groups for different purposes and with different effects, depending on who the groups are, where the boundaries are placed. Boundaries can be matters of choice or forms of enforcement. These might separate to provide protection for some people, while being spaces of exclusion for others. This chapter will turn now to explore some specific cases of boundaries and boundary making in the city. Talking about boundaries, so we've all got a definition in our heads. I like to visualise boundary in my head. I've got London. Hello, Tony Angel. So we've got London, for instance. You've got your Islamic State in London. You've got your Asian State in London. You got Ilford. Ulfa is almost like a Islamic State. Nothing wrong with that. It's just to make the segregation to stop. The inequalities, the arguments, to stop the criminology, the racism. It's all about equalities in life. And mixing culture doesn't always seem to work well together for some. I don't know why. I don't know why we can't just be bygones, big bygones, all breathe the same air. I know we have different religions, but it doesn't make us different as a human being. It doesn't make you different as a human being. It doesn't. If you bring success to the table, you've got a nice mannerism. I don't care what religion you are, as long as you condone yourself a nice mannerism, you're more than welcome in my vicinity. Doesn't matter where you're from. But anyway, physical boundaries. But obviously, you get imperative people that go out and overindulge in their lifestyle, and they become imperable with the way they relate with their neighbours, the way they relate with anyone, because the chemical imbalance isn't there. They start hating on people. You come here every day, you listen to me while I talk about talking absolute sense, and it makes sense because it's the truth. Anyway, physical boundaries. I mean, I heard a conversation on stereo the other day about the Jews being, it's because the Jews that they're rich, and why would you hate someone that's good with money? It doesn't matter if they're Jews, doesn't matter if they're Asian. Everyone hating on someone, you're not going to get anywhere in life. Don't be a player hater, play the game, they say. So, just get on with everyone. It's all about qualities. Everyone gets on. This is my second life chance. I'm in university today. I'm trying to make something of myself. And I see a lot of graduated students talking about, convicts. Why make a conflict with a conversation? Let's just make it equal. All fair share, a fair crack at the whip. None of this M word, none of this redneck word. Let's all get on. Simple. Simple maths. Physical boundaries. Physical boundaries come in many forms such as walls, barriers, gates and barricades. This section looks in particular at the type of physical boundary that separates private residential housing from the wider urban environment. An increasingly popular trend across the globe is the flight of households from mixed city spaces into self-segregated homogeneous housing enclaves. Gated communities. This section considers how these gated communities create physical boundaries between different groups of living within the city. Sarah Blandy et al. 2003 provides definition of the gated community: walled or guarded using walled or fenced housing developments to which the public access is restricted, often guarded using CCTV and or security personnel, and usually characterised by legal agreements, tenancy and leasehold, which tie the residents to the common code of conduct. Jot down what you think are the attractions of these gated communities. What kind of boundaries do they illustrate? Do they have different meanings for different people? To me, that's like that could be anything, couldn't it? I mean, the armed forces, their sergeants, they'd have gated community. Someone high up in the hierarchy, they are prominent people in their job, maybe local councillors, politicians, or high up in the fire department. They're high up in their job. They want safety for people coming in. Because when you're high up in your job, you won't be able to sleep at night knowing that people ain't coming after you. You should just sack someone, or they could be prison guards. Could be anything. You don't know the answer. So we're not going to make a discussion on something we don't know definite, but it's bound to be something along their lines. High up in their job, they don't, they need to be protected. What you might have to consider is a gated community provides safe and secure space for people away from the turmoil of the city, where people preserve others who are different from them as threatening and potentially dangerous. Boundaries that exclude others from these residential enclaves are several. At the physical level, there are usually gates or high electrified fences. These boundaries are visible, fixed and not all permeable. There is also a whole suite of material practices that construct boundaries, from the showing of identity cards and the gates to driving into an electronically controlled private garage. These practices work to minimise contact with threatening, unknown others, thereby building an imagined sense of security and community. Yet there is another kind of boundary at stake here that is less visible, and this is economic. The people who can afford to live in these kind of gated communities are those with high incomes, since these are usually expensive places to live. This represents a boundary of exclusion that is invisible but equally powerful. So imagine, me sitting here 6 more years, I'm doing more and more academics, trying to get into this lifestyle. It's what I should have done when I was younger, like sometimes life spent can be wasted. Never too late in life to make it, Just keep pursuing your dream. So I say, doesn't matter if you're 40, doesn't matter if you're 60, keep pursuing it. You've still got long life ahead of you. In 2004, there were 1,000 gate communities in England. Atkinson and Flint, 2004, which most clustered in the southeast. Segregation of residential areas represents an attractive commercial venture for developers who can increase their profits with the promise of safety and security to their residents. According to the Building Balanced Communities, Minton 2012, 65% of the 18 to 24-year-olds and 44% of those over 65 think gay communities are a good thing, acting to provide greater security. Some residents claim the concern about the crime was the main reason for choosing to live in a gated community. The new popularity of gated communities is thus profoundly embedded in a climate of fear, the search of greater security characteristics of the contemporary city. Cy Borman is a significant figure in sociology and, in his turn, the attraction of these residential enclaves, as they are sometimes called, represents a spatial shift into the city of mixophilia to mixophobia, which city residents are increasingly reluctant to live alongside those who are different from themselves. According to Borman, mixophobia and widespread response to the overwhelming variety of lifestyles and differences that people encounter each day in the city streets, and to those accumulated anxieties which tend to unload against the selected category of the aliens, picked up their epitomised strangeness as such. In chasing them away from one's homes and shops, the fighting ghost of uncertainty is, for a time, exercised. It is a mixophobia. He suggests that drives individuals into self-segregation in walled and fortified enclaves like many others. Borman attributes this drive towards similarity and sameness to the fact that people in cities are overwhelmed and discomforted by the strangeness and unknowability of others. Boundaries in gated communities that exclude others are visible and fixed. Good communities can be seen as embedded in a climate of fear and a result of the search for greater security. But, the mixophobia, I'm not worried about mixing in with different ethnicities. It's just how the adults bring up what they've been brought up through life, isn't it? If you brought your youngsters through racial segregation, you brought them up in the wrong light. Then it's a worry for walking throughout the youth of today, how they're going to act in your presence. Are they going to stab me when I go to my local shop? So, we've all got that anxiety in us, no matter what ethnicity you are. I've got every single ethnicity in my skin that you can believe of. But, you just walk, if you're Asian, you walk into the street where it's just full of white people, you're going to feel a bit of anxiety. One of these youth for today, call your names or throw something at you. Same as me. I've walked down Green Street alley. A few Asian youngsters there. They probably ain't playing a ball game, but in my head I'm thinking, I've seen it in films where they attack just a white lad on their own. You see it on films. But it's not true. 9 times out of 10, this is something, you give them ammo for their arsenal to fire something back at you. That's what happens, like you see that EDL group Tommy Robinson, he give a lot of ammo for their Islamophobia to go crazy at him. And he deserved it for the things he's come out with. It's absolutely disgusting the way he put them across. And I do not vote for that EDL group at all. I'm not, very, very, it's disgusting. Yeah, shocking. Extraordinary. Shouldn't be. That's why he moved to Spain, because he opened his mouth. He didn't speak in a nice mannerism about him, and he's then segregated himself to Spain because I think he'd been a wanted man after a short while. Got put in 10 months in prison as well. That's why you're very, very careful when you talk about race from any different side of the fence. You can be careful how you subjugate things. You can upset the wrong community. You've got to be polite and try and aim it from a perspective where you're taking a pinch of salt from each corner of the ethnicity you're talking about. Anyway, moving on. Symbolic boundaries. In this section, you'll be looking at symbolic boundaries. Those boundaries that may not be as visible as physical ones, but will have particularly significance and meaning to certain groups or individuals in the community. Activity 4. I mean, in London you've got Chinatown, so that's that answer to that question, isn't it? What's the meaning? We have a lot of Chinese shops, Chinese food, Chinese, people. It's the community. That's what it thrives because of the name of the town. You have begun to see how one kind of boundary around a gated community operates in the city to exclude some groups, but include others. Those who we think of as more like ourselves. Now take a moment to reflect on some examples of symbolic boundaries in our nearest city and jot those down. How do those boundaries operate to exclude some groups and not others? I'm not going to go into that, but what I'm going to say is before, just so we've all got an understanding before we get into any segregation arguments with other people. Before we get into any ethnicity argument, always think everything you eat, medicines you take, the mobile phone device you use, the clothes you wear, the car you drive. Think where they're mechanically made. Where were they deported from? Where, the coffee grain you have. Ethiopia, Vietnam. Think where they're distributed from before you get into racial argument. You think them people you're arguing with thinking you're an absolute idiot. Drinking my cup of coffee from my nation, but yet you're discriminating my nation. So you make yourself look like a dipstick before you start. You've got to think in a positive attitude before you get into racial dispute. I'm on the phone now, I'm having an argument with people, generally because I can't understand them. But I'm quite, it's like, you've got bills to pay, you're on the phone, you want to get paid, and you've got someone that can't speak. Unfortunately, they can't speak English, not their native language, my native language. But I'm in England, you expect an English person to be on the phone, but everyone comes to England, they all try and commute over here to get their education, be doctors or whatever in a country, which is absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal, They're doing their job when other British people can't do it. It's phenomenal. So you can't mock them for doing what they do. But yeah, I get agitated because I've got like 10 bills to pay in one day. I want to get on the phone, get into the next phone bill, get into the next bill, get into the next bill, and it's taking up my time trying to speak to the occupiers on the phone. Anyway, moving on. There are kind of boundaries that are symbolic and less visible in the city. These kinds of boundaries operate in different ways. These might be as visible signs that you are entering an area which belongs to a particular community, for example, rainbow flags in a gay area, or different languages on shop fronts, such as Chinatown. There you go. A group of people might frequent an area on a regular basis and are high visibly present, making it their own. You could think there are public spaces that young people take over or skateboard in, and which maybe people are fearful of entering, though there are no visible or physical boundary of exclusion. In fact, the space has been claimed by a particular group, preserved as threatening that operates to construct a boundary. Think of a gay community. Brighton, we might have them multi-coloured flags up there. Camden is also London gay pride as well. You're just thinking about specific places in our head. The Jewish above offers a fascinating illustration of a symbolic boundary. The Orthodox Jews Sabbath in the day that it is set aside for the rest and calm away from the fast pace of weekday life, which involves a cessation of labour and various kinds. Various restrictions are laid down in Jewish law, imposing prohibitions and on the Sabbath, which include the carrying of objects from private domains to public domains and vice versa. These public domains include streets, through affairs, open areas, highways, and so on. Private domains are homes and flats in residential. Residential areas are enclosed and surrounded by the wall. In these private areas, carrying objects on the Sabbath is permitted. The proposal of the Arath of enclosure, which in Hebrew means mixing and joining together, is to integrate a number of private and public properties into a larger private domain for the purpose of the Sabbath, so that activity normally allowing only in the private domain can be performed. Bellins 2000, Watson 2005. Once and a roof is constructed, individuals with the designated area are permitted to carry and move objects across, which is hitherto a private public boundary. This may include anything from carrying of house keys to pushing of a stroller or wheelchair. The construction of a roof is thus of particular relevance to women with small children and people who are frail or disabled, or in other words, those effectively excluded by age, gender or infirmity from public spaces on the Sabbath. The practice of democrating thereof has been used Orthodox Jews for 2,000 years. For an area to be reconstituted and private domain, it must cover over a minimum of 12,000 square feet and be demarcated from its surroundings by the wall boundary of some sort. Already existing boundaries such as fences, rivers, railways, or even rows of houses can serve as the basis of thereof. But where the boundary is not continuous or is broken, for instance, by a highway, boundary line must be constructed to maintain the enclosed space. To construct the enclosure, and a rough can use existing poles in the street, such as telephone or electric cable poles, or new poles can be erected. Those are joined either by existing wires, usually the lowest in place, or by a new wire made from material such as fishing line or plastic cable, which is usually very difficult to see. In the construction of the Aravan, the plural of the Arav in the UK and the United States, those most invisible boundaries have some sites of contestation, even though their intrusion on the street landscape in minimal. Vincent and Worf 2002. There are Aravan in many urban areas. The globe vary in size from a small front yard of Orthodox Jewish medical staff to work on the Sabbath, to ones that matches the boundaries in whole cities, as it is often a case of Israel. The largest Arav in the UK is in Barnet in North London. Ladies and gents, page 188. I'm going to leave that there. Thank you all for coming through, ladies and gents. You guys on my YouTube channel, Proclamation News. You guys on YouTube, thank you so much. I've got to go. God bless. I'll be back to tomorrow shortly. Hello.